obviously he advocated the Bill of Rights and he digested all of the suggested amendments, and really just, it's interesting too to look at the annals from the first Congress. They didn't want to enact that thing. It was stocked with Federalists who didn't want to hamstring the government. Madison just kind of browbeat them into adopting it. But I think his greatest achievement is, and I mentioned this earlier, is the notion of well-organized politics being the key to maintaining a just and fair and decent government.
Hi, this is Tony Williams, Senior Fellow at BRI, and we are pleased to bring you another episode of Scholar Talks. For this episode, we are honored to have on scholar Jay Cost, who is going to discuss his book, James Madison, America's First Politician, as part of the American Founder series. Now, the guiding question for this series is, what core contribution did this founder make to liberty and constitutional self-governance? Now, Jay Cost is the Gerald R. Ford Non-Resident Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, AEI, where he focuses on elections, politics, and public opinion. He's also a columnist for National Review and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. His articles in the popular press have appeared in National Affairs, National Review, the Wall Street Journal, and many others. He's also the co-host of the Ricochet podcast, Constitutionally Speaking, which you should definitely check out. And James Madison is his fourth book, and we actually appeared together at the National Constitution Center, which I'm sure is available at the NCC website, on a panel discussing Alexander Hamilton a few years back, if you remember, and you were discussing your book, The Price of Greatness, on Madison and Hamilton, another remarkable book. So Jay, I want to thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Tony. It's great to be here. Great to see you again.
Yeah, great. Thank you. Thank you. I really love this book, and you've taken James Madison, a complicated figure, certainly a great thinker, as well as a statesman with a very long career in public affairs. And you've made him very digestible, very readable, but really some reasoned judgments as well. I look for kind of those key interpretation moments. And I just think you and Basic Books have just done a remarkable job putting together just a great book on Madison. I mean, I have a shelf full of books on Madison behind me, and it ranks up there with some of the best of them. So great job.
Thank you very much.
I really like your take on Madison too, right? We know that Madison was a great thinker about constitutional issues, Republican self-government, human nature, right? But he wasn't a theorist, right? He wasn't a professor in a classroom. He was also a practical politician and statesman as well.
Yeah, that's right. And I wanted to connect his thinking to his political practice. And I guess that was a problem that I had with the existing Madison corpus, is that there seemed to be two sets. There seemed to be the intellectual political theory interpretations that focus really on a pretty narrow slice of his life, 1787, 86 through 89, right? So the lead up to the Constitutional Convention and the defense of the Constitution at the ratification debates. That's all very good, but it's, again, in a very narrow slice of his life. And then there's the more biographical works that focus on his entire career. And what I had aspired to do in this book was to try to bridge that gap and try to argue that Madison's thinking about politics is broader than what we get in 1786 to 89, and that also the way he thought about politics is very similar to the way he practiced politics. That he was, in a lot of respects, a new political man, an archetype almost, I would say. I mean, the founders at that time, they all were in many respects, because this is the first moment in a millennium, or more than a millennia, really, that we have democratic Republican politics in any kind of meaningful way. And so they're all breaking new ground. And I thought it would be interesting to write a book to try and show how the way he practiced politics can inform his political thinking, and also how his political thinking can inform how he practiced politics.
Okay, yeah, makes sense. And you describe the Constitution ratification moment, to borrow a phrase from Churchill, as Madison's finest hour, and that he was, to quote a saying about Washington, that he was the indispensable man of American politics in creating a new vision of republicanism and constitutionalism during that key Madisonian moment you just mentioned.
Yeah, so the argument that I make in the book is the founders were struggling with questions about justice in the public sphere that plagued the ancient Greeks, going all the way back. How does one secure the public interest through the public authority? How do you keep the public authority from being perverted by the rulers and used towards their own ends? And Madison felt, going into the Constitutional Convention, I mean, he wrote a letter to George Washington in the spring of 1787. Nobody's come up with an answer to this question. The problem we have with democracy, he told Washington, was that democracy tends to devolve into mob rule, or another way of saying that, if the people, the majority, have all the power, then they're going to 51% of the people will use the public authority to rob 49% of the people. The alternative solution was a sovereign, a monarch, somebody whose prestige and glory and honor were so great that he would literally sit above all the factions and all the petty rivalries, with only the interest of the country in his heart. But Madison, again, says to Washington, we know from experience that doesn't work either. So Madison is confronting this question. And again, like I said, this is a question that, Polybius was asking this question about ancient Rome. What was the solution the Romans had figured out? Polybius wanted it. And Madison's solution, I think, is really interesting and really bracing. And I think that it has ended up becoming the defining solution, which is politics itself. A well-organized political system is the way in which you can reconcile competing factions. And I think that is the centerpiece of his political thinking, and especially the idea of politics being the way by which diverse interests find consensus. I think that's embodied in his Virginia plan. And I also think that even though he was immensely frustrated by the compromises at the Constitutional Convention, I do think the Constitution as a whole embodies this notion of Madisonian consensus. So that's really what I think, what I was going for in the book.
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. So Madison shifts from this constitutional moment over to the 1790s. We're in the new nation, and he becomes very concerned rather quickly about Alexander Hamilton's centralizing policies, particularly his financial policies, in the 1790s, and Madison serving, as part of the Jeffersonian political opposition, right? Mm-hmm. We sort of this idea of a legitimate opposition. So you argue that this is a reaffirmation. So unlike some other scholars, you argue this is a reaffirmation of Madison's Republican principles, rather than, let's say, a break with the past.
Yes, I think that where I differ from a lot of other writers about Madison, and those who have argued that this is a problem for him, it's an inconsistency, is that it's important not to get too hung up on the debate over the size and scope of political power, of governing power. I think that meaningfully for Madison, his objections to Hamilton's system were rooted in a sense that he was trying to stretch things beyond what the convention had suggested. And I also think as well that because the Virginia ratifying convention was very closely fought, and a lot of promises were made to skeptics, people in the middle, that this was not going to be some immense power grab, because that's what Patrick Henry and George Mason were arguing in Virginia in June. And Madison was very careful in making the point that this is not going to be some power grab. I also think that's why he pushed so hard for the Bill of Rights too. I think he felt obligated by his experience in the ratifying convention. But put that aside, I think the bigger issue for Madison in his opposition to Hamilton gets down to this divergence about who governs, right? So in Madison's conception of Republican politics, I talked about this a moment ago, broad, diverse factions emerge and arrive, and they compromise and they reach consensus. Hamilton's vision of who governs is more elitist. I think Hamilton was more struck and inspired by the Walpole's vision of governance, where the executive uses patronage to secure votes in Congress for what is essentially the public good. And, that's Hamilton honestly believed that. And at the time, that was a perfectly legitimate understanding of how Republican politics should function. But I think for Madison, it was too elitist, in the sense that it was going to, he felt, and I think he was right to feel this way, that it was going to ensconce in power what they would have called a moneyed class, because Hamilton was using the instrument of the public debt as a way to, secure the national interest. But that was very, very beneficial for the holders of the debt, who were also going to be able to become owners of the Bank of the United States. And all of this added up to Madison feeling that Hamilton's economic program was too elitist. Even if going into the convention, he would have said, okay, it's fine for the national government to exercise these types of powers. Coming out, he would have said, well, no, we agreed we wouldn't. But I think the bigger issue was not so much the scope of the government's power, but who is wielding it and on whose behalf.
Very good, and a great segue. Speaking about Hamilton, because later on, after some of the failures of the War of 1812, as you write about, Madison does seem to embrace some Hamiltonian economic policies. Although, admittedly, you talk about how he made them his own and sort of more Republican character to them. This is at the end of his second term, and so again, the question is, is he being inconsistent, adopting these Hamiltonian policies that he had argued against 20 years ago? Or, do politicians, do statesmen, do they adjust to changing circumstances? Do they just act in the public good? And 20 years later, we just have a changing world and changing America.
Well, I think that Madison was incorrect in the set. I think that his analysis of the power relations in Hamilton's economic system were very on point. But I think that he misunderstood the utility of Hamilton's system. And I think that he and Jefferson were both locked into an understanding of republicanism that, I think was basically the agrarianism of the ancient Romans, to be honest. And it was just not something that was going to be relevant moving into the 18th century, where Britain is already in the midst of the commercial revolution. America aspires to be. This was an outdated economic worldview. It was already an outdated economic worldview. Now, Hamilton, what makes Hamilton so unique, I think, and so worthy of honor, is that he saw this before anybody else. So saying that Madison didn't see this is really just a way of praising Hamilton in the 1790s. Madison does see it in the after the War of 1812, because the financial condition of the country is an absolute disaster in the War of 1812. They kill the Bank of the United States in 1811, and you get all these state banks that are just running amok because there's no central financial institution that's able to curtail them. And the next thing you know, they stop having to suspend gold payment in gold, and it's just a disaster. So economically, there was really no alternative to rechartering the Bank of the United States. But I think, though, 2 points for you is that the way it was designed the second bank was designed in a way where the benefits of the bank were spread more evenly across the country. Even by that time, the American economy had evolved into a way that a central bank like that would be more beneficial to poor farmers in the South and West, because New England and the Mid-Atlantic already had state banking systems. And also they changed the organization of the bank in ways to give it tighter control from the government. So I think in those ways, if you look at the Bank of the United States as it was rechartered in 1815, it's much more egalitarian. So it's much more consistent with Madison's politics. But I think this is one of Madison's great faults here. And I think that he tried to adopt the Bank of the United States without coming out and saying, okay, we need a constitutional amendment. The issue is that in the 1790s, Madison threw pretty much every argument that he could against the bank. And one of the arguments that stuck the hardest was the constitutional argument, that this is not legitimized by the necessary and proper clause, right? And by 1815, Madison doesn't even want to, he's not even willing to admit, okay, that was wrong. It is. Instead he says, well, I thought that, but we have 20 years of precedent saying it's fine, so it's fine. And I don't think that's a legitimate constitutional hermeneutic. And I don't think that Madison was willing to apply it evenly across the board, because his last major act as president was to veto what was called the bonus bill, which would have created a fund for internal improvements. And Madison said, well, we don't have sufficient precedent for internal improvements. Of course, he did have precedent for internal improvements. When Jefferson and Congress admitted Ohio into the Union, they created exactly that kind of a fund. Land sales would go to subsidize the Cumberland Road, and Madison himself, as president, expanded the Cumberland Road project. And then in retirement, of course, he gets letters from Republican congressmen saying, if the bank's legitimate, why isn't this legitimate? So I don't think Madison had a consistent understanding of what the Constitution allows and what the Constitution doesn't allow. And I think that was that was his one great intellectual failure. I don't see it as inconsistency in the 1790s, but I do think that in 1815, he should have said, I'm sorry, we need an amendment.
Right. Okay. This is a big question. We can talk about it all day, but our last question is, we have this lifetime of public service. I think you mentioned 41 plus years, just great service to the Republic. What is, to answer the main question for the series, what is Madison's main contributions to liberty and self-governance, constitutionalism?
Yeah, there's so many things you could say. Obviously, he advocated the Bill of Rights, and he digested all of the suggested amendments, and really just, it's interesting too to look at the annals from the first Congress. They didn't want to enact that thing. It was stocked with Federalists who didn't want to hamstring the government. Madison just kind of browbeat them into adopting it. But I think his greatest achievement is, and I mentioned this earlier, is the notion of well-organized politics being the key to maintaining a just and fair and decent government. And a vision of politics that I think he articulated is politics being the way by which we find mutually satisfactory compromises. And I think that that vision of politics is so strikingly at odds with how we view politics today, where we see politics as almost kind of as a war, where the goal of one side is to crush and destroy the other side, which is ridiculous in and of itself because nobody's going anywhere. But also that's not what he thought politics should be. And I think, one of the things that I think Jefferson and Madison don't get credit for is the era of good feelings. It's usually like, well, it only lasted a couple years and the next thing. But think about this, that when Madison retired from public life, the minority party, the Federalist Party, had basically been absorbed. His successor was effectively unanimously chosen as president, and when he was reelected in 1820. There was widespread political harmony, and in many, many respects, you can chalk that up to the victory of the War of 1812. But, Madison and Jefferson were very intent on reconciling former Federalist opponents to their cause. And I think it's really striking that when Madison died, probably the most memorable encomium for him was written and delivered by John Quincy Adams, who was the son and himself had been a Federalist in his youth. And I think that speaks a lot to how seriously he took the project of politics as an attempt, not at war, but at reconciliation and mutually satisfactory compromises. And I think that is his most important contribution.
Jay, that's a wonderful, optimistic note to end on. I wish we could emulate it today, right?
Yeah, me too.
But Jay Cost, author of James Madison, America's First Politician, I want to thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks for having me.
And thank you all for joining us on this episode of Scholar Talks. Please check out our other interviews in this series on the American founders. Also check out our interviews on the American founding, including Rob McDonald on Thomas Jefferson, David Stewart on George Washington, Lindsay Stravinsky on Washington's cabinet, and Bradley Thompson on the Declaration of Independence. And check out BRI's curricula on the American founding, which are several, but they include Life, Liberty, and the Pursuit of Happiness, and also the updated Being an American. Thank you.